Okay, so if you can just take a few moments to reflect while we get the last few people in the room, and then we can start discussing some of the ideas and issues that have emerged while you've been walking around. Okay, so hopefully most of us are in the mode now of doing and working, and have a good sense in the room of ways in which we might take forward this, this challenge of advancing critical university studies and making connections that can hopefully not just contribute in studying the transformation, but in transforming, being impactful in that way. So can I invite some contributions?
Yeah, like what's the main ideas and strategies that emerge in this discussion?
Yeah, I think in terms of the main concepts or main ideas that emerged over the last couple of days that we have been engaged with, and I think there is a strong need for critical university studies in every country, if possible, to start the beginnings of that. And I think once you have that, then the network becomes stronger. We'll have like-minded people to join that. But also at the same time, we'll have there'll be an open space for discussion. And until that happens, I mean, I know that, as I said, just speaking on the fact that I am working on the Indian side of it, they are setting up a higher education council. Now, if I get into the higher education council at some level of intervention, we will be able to influence policies.
Great.
Main ideas and strategies.
Okay, I think one thing that I've seen in several tables is the need to create something like an online platform or a hub that will work as a not only as a networking, but also as a kind of, you go there for resources as well. You go there for papers, for thematic areas of research. So I think it seems to be one of the most practical things we could go ahead and start putting together. And there are either national funding schemes that we might pursue, or international or EU funding schemes that we might pursue to actually start creating this hub. We have to make, this group and the networking, first of all, known to others, and then open to others as well to come in, so enrich the network as well.
Just to add on to that, I think it would take some labor for somebody or a group of people to actually look after it. Because if you just have it there, it becomes unused. So one does need to have a dedicated person or persons who are actually putting stuff there.
I also saw that the idea of creating a hub, I know it's already there with the networking, keeps repeating it. And I was wondering about an association. There could be an ACUS association that might create also a kind of institutional form, having boards and all these other different things.
There is a mic on your table.
Okay, thanks. Is it okay? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was struck when I was walking around the tables looking at a lot of the suggestions. What a lot of them had in common was about finding ways of bringing people together. But there seemed to be a number of different perspectives on that. In relation to creating a network, there were some perspectives saying that it should be intentional, so there should be sort of boundaries to who is allowed into it, where there's other perspectives are encouraging a much more open network as a way of trying to tap into as many possible sources of ideas as possible. So that's one thing to think about. The other way in which they differed was in the extent of, if you like, formality. in terms of goals? You know, was it about establishing centres or curriculums or things like that, or is it creating space for people to talk? And so there's something to think about in those particular ways. Second point I wanted to make, it's a point that I had on my bit of paper here, but because my handwriting's so bad, I suspect hardly anybody saw it. In the work I do with schools, one of the problems that I've always seen with education research is and practice is the idea of best practice. Because the idea of best practice works on the assumption that for any given problem, someone somewhere has already solved it, and all you've got to do is to find that answer and apply it, and then everything will be okay. What happens in practice is that if you apply best practice, things are never actually okay. So the concept that we've used is the concept of next practice. Next practice. Working on the assumption that for any given problem, everyone who you're working with has a bit of the possible solution, and you want to try and connect those bits and amplify some of the signals and try things, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, then you learn from that and try something else. The analogy we use when we're talking to teachers is instead of looking over your shoulder to see what's already been done, you should be consciously trying to look over the horizon to create new ways of thinking and new ways of acting.
So just actually, my points actually follow on really nicely from Tony's, not intentionally, but anyway. The first is about intentionality, being closure. I think it's possible to be intentional without closure, and the way to do that is to have clearer conversations, facilitated and clearer conversations about what our intentions are, because I don't think that can be assumed that we know what our intentions are and what lies, behind intentionality. So I agree that, it could cause closure, but the second point really is, as a sociologist who studies networks and online mobilization in general, I really liked Encarnacion's point about an association, but what makes networks and associations work is meeting in person. So that's the difference between networks that mobilize and networks that don't mobilize, is whether they meet person to person, and therefore I had the suggestion that this type of meeting should be regular. It should be something that you can put in your diary and plan for. It doesn't have to be every year. It could be every other year, every 4 years, whatever the group thinks is reasonable. And I think that's a next practice.
Other emerging things that people saw?
I think also one of the important things would be for this space to be open to graduate mobility or exchange programs, so that graduate students are also exposed to some of the conversations and the extent to which they can contribute.
One very quickly, I think they don't know this, but one potential source of funding that could be useful is GCRF Network Plus funding, because that's specifically about trying to build a network. And I'm putting together a bid for that on something else, but that sounds like exactly the sort of source that we could look to.
Just to add to that, there's also the Newton project, which is part of it.
And considering that GCRF has funded this, we start from a nice position.
We should engage the African Union and all these regional bodies, because this is so important for our continent. They may not be funding things directly in the area, but we should approach them. And
between Europe and Africa, so I think we should explore this. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, specifically for the graduate component of it, the initial training network, I think that's that we should leverage that anyway. And also national research councils, we should lobby them to contribute towards a multilateral pot. You know, that if all the African and then countries' research councils say that that's a priority, they don't have to commit the money yet, they could say that there's a priority, and then we could build that up.
Well, there's German Africa funding from the DFG for thematic strands. So it needs to be more thematically binded. Chief?
Give us the number.
Yeah.
Give us the amount, brother.
Yeah. Just two things. One is the question. One, certainly, government has got some of this funding, for collaborations. Maybe a related question. Government is in Department of Higher Education and Training. A related question would be, do we draw a line between critical university studies and higher education studies? And why I'm saying it's related, if, for instance, we don't necessarily draw a line, wouldn't that be one of the collaborations that would need to be created between universities that have these areas of study? In my mind, I'm thinking University of Western Cape, my alma mater, yeah. that focuses on higher education.
Well, why are you looking at me?
Yeah, so perhaps if we can just pass that over.
Yes, master over, yes.
Well, I know nothing about that unit. I just supervise PhD students there. But there's a school of post-school studies rather than higher education. I'm not sure about Rhodes, whether they actually have, I know they've got a PhD in higher education, but there's Joy Papier at UWC, who won,
So the possibility of partnerships and drawing from the mainstream higher education studies, or the bitterness of teaching and learning, analysis of the political economy of higher education, all of these sorts of things, and bringing that, definitely. I think there's an appetite for moving in.
Critical higher university studies.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Otherwise, we cannot give up now.
Yeah.
Because I think that higher education studies, conventionally speaking, is actually in need of this particular kind of conversation. Yes. Yeah. Okay. And so one has to carefully frame that interaction. Okay. Because the discursive frames are actually legitimated via those conventional studies. And that's precisely the ones that we're trying to break free from. Yes. Okay. So so we have to think carefully about partnerships and so on. So there will be a kind of inclusivity with its own sets of parameters. That's just how these kind of things work,
Yeah.
I think, It's an inevitable space if one has to contribute to this. No.
I know, it kills the things, doesn't it? It's recording things, right?
Oh, it's recording, but I'm done now. No, I'm not joking. Yeah. Chief, you still have to complete your PhD,
Can I ask for also possibly impressions from those who walked around? I mean, there has been some discussion, but perhaps if I can ask for those who have brought in, particularly in terms of advancing on the continent, what you found when walking around is a powerful sense of something that's important. Amos, I don't know if you want to, if I'm putting you on the spot.
Yes, I see the main points there, literally being the networking, which connects with a group of people, and then also the next practice. I really, yeah.
And of course, we will have to strategize ourselves around connections on our continent. We say, so it's both a national discussion and a discussion with the quality of the continent. But we'll have that as a separate.
It's a separate discussion.
It's a separate discussion. And those networks are already in the making. You say as we continue. So.
I think the only observation I see in all that we've written is that there is still that delink from practice of these critical studies. You know, it doesn't get into the practice side, and yet we are arguing that critical thinking assists us to manage the practice. And I think there is a lot of network, online, and the thing one would be asking, networking, what is the pin of that networking? Or if I was to ask, for example now, what is our theory of change? Probably the global theory of change now is inclusion, probably. Inclusion, yeah? So that all should be included, leaving no one behind, all that. Is that something that critical university studies sees as its domain, or it's so abstract that there is nothing that is on the ground that touches on it? I struggle with it because I'm not into critical studies.
Yeah, thanks for raising that issue about the praxis side of it. And I think one of the things that I was discussing in our table as well is the idea that, you know, there are two layers. One is the layer of the policy, which allows for the practice to percolate down to the grassroots level. But there's a dialogue which is at that stratospheric level. But then the second part is where we have been much more at individual level what we can do. And I think we need to see how we can square the policy with the praxis, but then until we get it right in terms of what we want to do at the bottom-up level, to reach the guys at the top. Yeah, we need to have a perspective. So, and as I said, in terms of the SDGs and everything else, trying to make it more inclusive, yes, that's the direction. How do we educate more? And I gave the example in my own country that the demand is to provide employability for people, to have the skills, etc., etc. But then we say that is at the cost of philosophy, that's at the cost of things.
The question is that, and I actually am not too worried about the challenge on the table. This particular structure around the online networking will surface the practices already in this space. And of course, as you would know, there's a few of us who can probably name a number of practices already ongoing. So, but the challenge would be is that how do we fold that practice under a particular kind of set of theoretical frames, in the plural. Okay, a flexibility of interpretive, the possibility of a multiplicity of interpretive horizons and schemes that more or less has an emancipatory interest at its core, and that would be the theory within which this kind of work needs to be located. That kind of work, I think, is probably well developed in the spaces already there, in different kinds of settings. And so when we get to the project of networking, the online resource, that one over there, it will surface those kinds of practices now. And it will be both be to look over your shoulders to learn from those practices, and to look at the horizon to see what kind of new practices then can emerge from that. Which is, I would regard, my entire past 10 years in the university sector, as a practice rooted in critical university studies, for instance.
I mean, I wonder if Boni's concern, and I know in the next session we're talking about policy practice, right, and how to operationalize, but is also a potential unexplored space of sometimes where higher education studies, and some of us have operated, and critical development studies. That there's a lot in development studies that we're in the domain of, if we're talking about social justice, but we aren't leveraging it sometimes. And GCRF, Newton Fund, that larger the larger macro curriculum of funding is feeding into the SDGs and those things. But we need to be, my sense is we need to be like ahead of the game. And that's a sort of concern, is how to use those better, but by being also informed by those in critical development studies.
I think, when we listen to people, we realize that there's a lot of commonalities going around. So that's the one thing. The other thing, we're coming from different functions and areas within the university. So some of us are with maybe gender studies in the university, some are policy, some are curriculum, some are governance. There's a whole range of things. And it would be interesting to begin to, in the room as we sit here, identify where what those nodes are or what those vantage points are, so that we can also begin to think about how we can collaborate with each other and to share. For example, I'm interested in curriculum, but there's so much I need to learn about curriculum, and there's so many people I can learn from, and there's so many experiences I can learn from. So maybe we can think about identifying the kind of common themes or trends that emerged, and the common spaces, as in, or vantage points that also come into this space. I don't know if I'm clear.
No, it's perfectly clear. I like that. Can I suggest that there were actually two practical proposals? Now, the one is here, because I think this will probably have to be the starting point. It's how to hold the idea and the group together around a set of ideas, and whether people would be interested in discussing and working on the online platform as a form of networking, but of course with all these massive subheadings here, And out of these subheadings, the different kinds of bilaterals, trilaterals, collaborations will emerge that is held together under a broad set of parameters. And there people can do whatever they want to do that is connected under that, and that the network makes provision for a broad frame, under which those can fold as well, but not to stifle any forms of bilateral collaborations in the space. You see, and I think that is what you have in mind then.
Yes.
And so the thematics, we will also have to share tomorrow, and of course we will have to take up discussions with ourselves over lunch and over teas, and explore with people around here as to how those kinds of bilaterals will can find expression. For instance, I know for sure that my huge interest is to work with Winnie, Michael and Amos, because the idea of the university having to Africanize its internationalization strategy is a key area for the university to play to reorient its own character in relation to the continent. See? So that is so those kinds of bilaterals will emerge, of course, apart from the others that I already have in the space. But so if would it be okay for us then to discuss who would be interested in working on this particular kind of designs and discussions? Okay, Shervani is there, Dina is there, Amos. Oh, Amos, you have actually a nice platform. Thank you so much for that. Satish, Brightness, Winnie, Michael, Sue. It's the whole group wants to work on it. I'm just joking.
That is to set it up.
To set it up, yeah.
Because certainly we will contribute from our own interests.
Yes. Okay. No, for sure.
So this is sort of like an initial working group to operationalize the platform.
To operationalize the platform, yeah. So there's some names that I missed there. Put up your name as well. If it was Amos, Michael, Winnie. Do you want to join in here? Yeah. No, do you want to add your name? Yes. Okay, put in Beata. Just to keep. Okay, lovely. You see, Beata is thinking of a strategy. Jason? Oh, Jason is also there. Okay. And then I saw. Okay, this is great stuff, eh? Who would be the electronic convener of this group? Who will be the one that writes that first email saying, Amos will do it? Okay, Amos. You know Jenny most very well, so you'll get an email from Jenny tomorrow morning. Okay, okay, this is fantastic.
What's lovely about it is, look, we're having people from across different parts of the world.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, great stuff, yeah? Yeah. The DHET can provide funds for us. Now, Dina and I actually tried to strategize as to, you know, whether I can put out an advert for a postdoc that would like to work specifically on this, you know, and see whether we can't get the university to focus on the kinds of skills that are required to build that platform. And Amos, of course, if he starts talking about the platforms that they have, he won't stop. So I'm going to hand to him, but we can then, in discussing what Amos is saying, and whether the person may actually be based in Nairobi, you know. So we have to think about different kinds of strategies, no? And whether there will be nodal points of postdocs in different parts, you know, that can connect with the iterative development of the online platform, okay? And Luan's connections from his presentation will be part of those nodal points and dots there as well. But there must be a framing of an intellectual and political project now that puts forward a kind of distinctness, a kind of worry about the networks already in place, not a worry in the context of a competition, but just a worry in the context of whether what we have in place provide for sufficient social justice movements for the kind of work that we would like to do. No? And I think that part of the writings that you have found on our SharePoint, you know, have that particular worry in mind. I thought I saw another, would that particular, Dina, I'm just checking, would that particular grouping then also work around the question of the massive proposal then?
No, I think maybe we should.
That should be a different group.
Different group, okay, all right. Okay, Mike, please continue.
Let's constitute that group.
Okay, let's constitute the group. The proposal group. So now you are in two minds now, no? You're not in two minds. No, I'm just checking.
I'm just thinking who the group is, because if it's GCRF, then I can't leave the proposal group because GCRF is not my funding mechanism.
Okay, so it would be, I think it...
But it would probably be to move across different funding mechanisms. We can't put all the egg in one basket.
Yeah.
That basket may disappear when, I don't know, Brexit, whatever. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I would nominate Michael, Dina, and Michalinos. How does that sound to you? Good, no? Not a good proposal, eh?
Which Michael?
Michalinos.
Okay, before I write down names, then can we just get a sense, yes? No?
Do they have a choice?
I can support.
Make them do it. I say yes from Michael.
Mike, is it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Michalinos, on the network funding proposal. Is that okay?
Oh, I sense lots of hesitation.
Yeah. Because
No, it's a group. We're setting up a group. Okay, so it... Yeah. Yes, lovely. And then we can nominate Dina to be the convener of that group. How does that sound to you?
I'm like you, I feel afraid because of the burden of proposing onto an EU framework grant is quite a high burden, yeah? But if it can be shared, then it's maybe...
Yeah.
I certainly don't have the person time to be a coordinator of one from that
Okay.
mechanism.
I can work with you. I can work with you on the TCRs, all the UK funding.
Okay, lovely.
I
Thank
will
you.
look at the German African.
Yeah, and Karna, the German African.
This is the joy. We have different gazes do we then rework it for that?
Yeah.
That's what I think. That's the only way.
Yes.
So we're not locked into our geography.
Mm.
I'm just thinking the avenues to procure funding is different, but the basic framework should be the same. I mean, the proposal, so you're just basically working from one proposal, but you're sort of just slotting it into the different, yeah. You can put my name as well.
And also the idea that, of course, people will be differentiatedly invested in this project. No? Like for me, this will be part of any funding proposal that I put in. It's like just part of, it will probably be one of the first things. But it will not be the same for other people as well, you know? It may be the fifth, question for them in a funding proposal. And so if we then have a committed network like this, one can then, of course, put forward as one of the terms of reference of the network, or say parameters of operations of the network, is for people to source within their own spaces different kinds of funding for bilaterals or for collaborations and so on that falls under the network, like we do with the Global Decenter Network, Michael. You see, so well, which one is but this get but at least meeting. You know what I'm saying? Okay, how does that, anybody, Dina, do you have some closing remarks here before we break for?
So just to say, in the next session after this, we're going to be speaking particularly around the ways in which we both study and try to create an impact through our study of policy and regulation, so that is both within the university and wider, and also practice. So that began to emerge as we were discussing now, but that will be particularly the framing in the next session. So perhaps while we're having lunch, you're welcome to chat about it, but that's where we're moving now, is really trying to unwrestle those two sections. Thank you so much. We come back for after lunch at 1:30. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming back. Can I just check something with you in relation to the program? We are going to have a final, dinner type of thingy for all of us and wine later today. Say around about, we'll try and make it 5 o'clock so that you can get back to the hotel, an hour and a half after that. And then in between those spaces, between us finishing here and the dinner, you take a walk here on the campus and so on, and then also connect bilaterally with people that you would like to have a chat with, okay? I also have a need to do that in relation to a few people. How does that sound? So even then, if we finish at 4 o'clock, we hang around here, till we have supper and wine together, and we have different sets of discussions. Is that okay with you? And then for tomorrow, it seems, because we're trying to avoid the place running empty because people have to get to the airport, so we thought of either having a very short session around impact tomorrow, but Dina even thought that we can have it later today as well, if the house is okay with that. I'm not so sure. Today, yes. And then tomorrow you then actually have a free day. Michael, what are you saying? Do you think that we should push on with the program and try and finish it today? How does that sound to everybody? Show of hands, please. Okay. That vote is carried. That vote is carried. Yeah? Okay, Dina? Then it's now over to you.
that the scholarship of the critique of the university can very easily become just a way of publishing more and advancing one's career, okay? So there's a real need for us, and that's why we've done quite a lot in terms of policy, practice, regulation, to fight against that urge, but then also to see in ways in which they can speak and in ways in which to critique gaps between policy practice and those sorts of spaces. And so there will be this discussion now, which is really interesting because we have very different perspectives, two from outside of the academy and one from within. And then a session afterwards where we'll be trying really to tease these out. So if we are going to if we're going to continue after this, then I think what we'll try to do is from the discussion to pull out what are the sort of larger pathways to impact. And I think we'll probably need to have a bit of a discussion at that point as to what on earth that silly term means. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Luzuko.
Thanks a lot, Dina. I think that in a way summarizes my work. I'm here to basically introduce and facilitate the panelists or the contributors to this discussion. We'll keep the discussion within 30 minutes, but I wanted to make just some few reflections in introducing the speakers. That I think what's coming out here is that the idea of a critical university studies is to expose some of the challenges we face in our institutions, not for the sake of it, but for the sake of devising means and ways of changing them. I think hence the topic emancipatory imaginations. So there is a need to then create those interfaces within the institution, within the universities themselves and the universities and various other parties, and ensure that we also participate in policy, because policy influences universities, but also universities and academics have a responsibility to influence policy. But I think the idea in the creation of this part of the workshop was to get us to start to unshackle the philosophical underpinnings of policy, so that don't only contribute to policy when the policy has already been drafted, which is often the case. So I think that is the idea of this session. So, but this is without trying to make critical university studies as part of the cog in the policy making machine of our countries, but to see how we contribute at the philosophical level, so that we don't make critical university studies something that contributes to just outputs that can be used for a reading list in a higher education program, niched, spoken of, but forgotten. So it is my honor then to introduce our speakers and welcome them. It will first be Chief Mabizela, followed by Brightness Mangolothi, and later it will be Shervani Pillay. Chief, I invite you here to take your 10 minutes. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Luzuko. I just want to pick up from the point you made, because that's exactly what I thought of as I was preparing this. And also in the earlier exercise we did, the issue of grounding policy in higher education on the philosophy, which is somewhat opposite from what Satish was talking about. You know, I kind of envied your system if you're still thinking about grounding it philosophically, even if you have moved away from that from 1947. On our side, we don't even have those debates, unfortunately. And that's exactly
what I wanted to say, from the beginning, because it doesn't show here, the philosophical grounding of our policies. So colleagues have got 10 slides and I've got 10 minutes. So on an average of speed of light, I've got to flash through the slides quickly. But if you just have that in mind, and I thought maybe we can pick it up in the discussions later on. And for now, it's just to flash through the slides. And the other thing is this, I contemplated whether I really need to do the slides or just, give a talk. And I thought there are some slides that I would like to show the graphics so that you have a visual idea of what's happening. So when we talk policy and legislation in South Africa, and of course the plans, remember the topic is impact of policy, practice guidelines, and other regulations for the transformation of higher education. We've got this a false belief that our constitution, because our constitution is progressive, then the false belief is that it grounds our policies philosophically, which it doesn't. But anyway, we do have, in terms of legislation, the Constitution, the Higher Education Act in this regard. And I put the institutional statutes in brackets because they are not legislated necessarily through Parliament, but they are legal documents that must align with the Higher Education Act as well as the Constitution of the Republic. And then we've got the policies, national policies, the white paper. Again, the white paper does not provide that philosophy of what is it that we want. When I refer to philosophy of higher education in this case, what is it that we want from the graduates? What is it that we want our graduates to attain? Because what we keep on saying and keep on doing is to produce graduates for the labor market. And so when we then say the labor market is running short of artisans, and then we then go to education and say we need to produce engineers, we need to produce artisans, and so on and so on and so on. That's the problem. I think that's the problem in our country. And then we've got the ministerial statements. Every year, minister releases a statement. Largely it's on funding, but also on any other message that relates to policy that needs to be implemented. And then sector policies, for instance, the funding policy, research policy, language policy, and the others. And then we've got the plans, National Plan for Higher Education, which came out in 2001, and now it's being replaced by this one, National Plan for Post-School Education and Training. It's still going to be coming out. We're sure that it's going to come out this year because it's done now. And then the National Development Plan, which is the entire government plan for 2030. It came out in 2012, and so there are plans for 2030, and there are plans for education there and higher education in particular. So the Constitution, basically what it says is that our education system and all the things that we do should be founded on human dignity, the achievement of equality, and advancement of human rights and freedoms, non-racialism and non-sexism, supremacy of the Constitution, and the rule of law. So if you think of the discussions we had in the past 3 days on transformation of our higher education system, those first 2 points would relate exactly to what we aspire to do as the country based on the Constitution, and they are enshrined in our Constitution, particularly in the Bill of Rights. And when we talk of the freedoms, and again, Satish referred to, you didn't say institutional autonomy there. We referred to the academic freedom. You said academic autonomy, and I was thinking that probably it's just the same thing, but differences in terminology. But anyway, we refer to academic freedom, and then, which is enshrined in the Constitution, but then we then say academic institutional autonomy, which is then in the policy, in the white paper that's discussed there. So we make that difference in South Africa. And then the white paper with regard to the key challenge that needs to be addressed, basically stemming from the previous, from the history of South Africa, to redress past inequalities and to transform the higher education system to serve a new social order to meet pressing national needs. You can underline that if you want, meet pressing national needs. It's not education for the sake of education. It's not education for development of critical thinking and development of minds intellectually, but it's to meet national needs, the example I made, and to respond to new realities and opportunities. And the objective is to develop a learning society to meet the challenges of reconstruction and development, which was the program at the time. In fact, it's not just a term here, the issue of reconstruction and development. At the time when the Constitution in 1996 came, and then the policies that followed, there was a program of reconstruction and development. So it was, then the education system was basically supposed to be addressing that. Now, I'm saying all these things because we then need to be looking at the impact. And this is what we define transformation currently. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but if you look here, elimination of discriminatory practices based on gender, race, class, historical imbalances, the provision of inadequate infrastructure, and so on. So it's not, transformation is not just about the numbers. It's also about changing the culture, the cultures of the institutions. And this is what we have in a committee called the Transformation Oversight Committee for colleagues who are from outside. And Prof. Kiet is the chair of that Transformation Oversight Committee. So then, now, these are the slides that made me, decide on the PowerPoint, because I needed to give you visual, pictures of what's happening in the country. So quickly, this is 2001 and up to 2015. And this is the, of course, the proportion of enrollments percentage-wise in the higher education system by race. And these are the categories that we use in terms of racial divisions. They were used in the past, so we want to then keep on in the past as in during the apartheid period. So we want to keep on, we're still using them so that now we check how far we have gone in terms of changing the country. So, of course, this is the statistics now and not necessarily the changes in the culture of the institution. So you will see that from 2001, it started to pick up the composition of Africans from about 2006 going up, and you will see around the same time that that of white students started to go down, the percentages. So the growth here was offsetting the number of, or the percentage composition of the system by white students. And then here you have the colored and Indian students, sort of somewhat flat. But it doesn't mean that in terms of real numbers, there was no growth. It's just these are the percentages, remember. And then participation rate, I shall assume you know this slide, there's a slide there that explains it. So if you get in these slides, you'll see one of the slides is explaining what participation rate is all about. But again, participation by race. And this is, when we talk numbers, we think that we will make impression on transformation of the system if we change participation rate. All the other numbers don't really matter that much, but participation rate matters. So as you can see, overall, which is this one, our participation rate currently is around 20% in the system. The target for 2030 is 25%, and we benchmark ourselves, especially with the Asian countries, North Africa, the Arab countries in the north of the continent, That's where we're benchmarking ourselves. And so you will see the different race groups there for, their participation rate. Now, you can see that it's still reflective of the past, really, even though it's coming down from 60% of white students and 40% Indian students. And then, but it's somewhat coming down because there's growth here, right? And then gender, which is very impressive, and nobody can claim this one. You will see government claiming this one, but there's no policy at all that we've done in government to ensure this high percentage participation of women students. From 2001, as you can see, it's been higher than that of male students. And then it's growing. It's close to 60% now, and that of males, it's about, just about 40%. So we can't claim any policy on this one. But of course, we politicians, politicians will say, yeah, look at us, we are progressive. And then participation rate by gender, but I'm not getting into the analysis of at what point, at which programs, for instance, you'll find that engineering has got more males than women, and certain humanities or social sciences have got more women than men, and so on and so on. I'm not getting to that. I'm just giving you a flavor of this. So I guess, colleagues, you will get these slides, but this is just a summary of a committee. Crane was here with us in the first 2 days. So he headed a committee and assessed, the progress on transformation in our system. And that report came out in 2008, and basically was saying that there's a slow pace of transformation in this system. And that is not to look at the numbers, as I've shown you, but at the fabric of the institutions, the institutional cultures, looking at that. So I'm not going through the whole slide. And then the South African Human Rights Commission, that's the acronym there, also released a report 2 years ago, again saying the same thing. Institutions of higher learning have not sufficiently transformed in the last 20 years with regard to race, gender, culture, language, disability, and sexual orientation, amongst others. So basically, we haven't done much for the past 20 years or 25 years. And I think that will be it. So it's just my assessment here of basically summarizing what our assessment is. And again, I will just go back to what I said. I didn't critique the policy. I was just looking at the numbers and also what the recent studies are saying about the impact of our policies. So the discussion, yes, we'll get onto that. And this guy is harassing me too.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you very much, Chief. Trust me, Chief, the harassment is necessary. You work with this type of stuff, so you can go on and on and on. I know you, understandably. So now we've gotten the government, the perspective of a person who interfaces with government at a different level. We'll get another perspective from Brightness. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Maybe firstly, I need to officially introduce myself as Brightness Mangolothi. I'm working for HERSSA, which is the Higher Education Resource Services in South Africa. And our mandate is to develop women in higher education for leadership position. And with that said, it's very interesting. Thanks, Chief, for your presentation. I thought I would take an unconventional way of articulating the task at hand. And with that said, I believe we are talking about the impact, we're talking about policies. And a part of me says, people who actually normally formulate the policies are not the people who implement the policies. That is point number one. And the second point that I also want to articulate is that there is a development of policy and there is also the implementation of policy. So my intersection and my presentation will be more on the implementation of the policy, because for me, their implementation actually influence the impact of the policy. With that said, allow me to actually reflect on the context of South Africa. HERSSA developing women in higher education. What we also need to acknowledge is that in South Africa, we only, out of 26 universities, we only have 4 female VCs, that is vice chancellors. And if you look at the statistics when it comes to leadership, only 44.76 are women. And if you look at the professors, only 29% of the professors in 2017 were women. Now let's take it back. In the transformation, part of the presentation, it also talks about the regulation. We have a regulation in South Africa that is also driving transformation. That is the Employment Equity Act. The Employment Equity Act, it's about equality, it's about inclusiveness. Now the question is, we're talking about women. I think part of the previous conversation, we're talking about the intersection in South Africa, the race, the gender, the class, and so forth. But what is the reality? I want to move into a space of an institution. I also want to also say that a policy, it's a living document. It breathes. So I think, Chief, you've articulated also the first part that actually say, when the policy, in fact, what I'm missing, I was talking to my esteemed colleague here, and I'm trying to say, I find sometimes that academics are ignorant. Pardon me, academics. And what do I mean by that? Is that sometimes we are so absorbed with our discipline, and we don't really engage with what is happening in higher education. If I may ask at this particular juncture, there was a gender-based violence policy that was issued. How many of us were involved in providing inputs? Just one. I don't want to ask why you were not involved. Highly likely that you were not even aware that there are changes that are taking place. But it also says to me, it is important that we drive the policy, which is point number one. It is also important that we become engaged. I think there was also a conversation of being part or apart. Maybe instead of saying academics are ignorant, I could actually say academics are apart from what is actually happening in higher education. And it's our space, which we need to own. If we don't own it, other people will own it. But Chief, they'll come with policies, and we'll end up debating those policies, which is more of a reactive approach instead of following a proactive approach. But now let's come into a space where the policy needs to be implemented. That is an institution. But what is important? Within an institution, I hear we talk about so many things, but what is key for me, coming from a background of communication study, organizational behavior is important. The behavior of the organization is defined by the organizational climate. In this case, we talk about the institutional climate. So how is the climate of the institution? I normally, at some point when we had the former VC, I teased him and I said, is Nelson Mandela a home for all of us? Is it welcoming for all of us? And I think you need to also take back that question to your institution. Is it inclusive enough? Do people feel welcome? Or is it an inside-outside approach or in-groups, out-group approach? Now let's get into the other factor. I think, Kit, you say it so nicely for me when you talk about the 6 economies, when we talk about institutional culture. In most cases, when we reflect on an organization, we think about governance processes and management processes. And what I've come to appreciate about the organization, what impedes transformation, it's basically committees within the institution. Your research committees, your ethics committees, they actually impede transformation. It is quite sad that when you talk about ethics committees, research committees, you find a space where most academics are actually telling their students, you know what, don't do any research which is sensitive. Just do a desktop research, because they're trying to avoid the whole process which is unnecessary. I think sometimes I felt like the research spaces are not learning spaces, are very punitive spaces, where you are actually, just by making one error, you are told, send it back, and then the committee will meet only after 3 months, and it's not favorable for the students. So all those committees influence and inform what happens in an organization. In a South African context, it might be naive to actually not acknowledge that our institutions are still male, which are white, dominated. And where are these white males sitting? In senior position. These white males are sitting in Senate committees. The question is that, can't be possible. The question is that, if we say we want to drive the change, and this is the part where I say when the majority is wrong, because you cannot expect this particular committee, which is white male, which is trying to sustain the status quo to drive the change within the organization. But what I've also picked up, is there a commitment in implementing policies? Probably the commitment is very important, but again, I sometimes find that there is no communication of policies. Institutions have a tendency of sending an email and say, familiarize yourself with the policies. If you are engaged in the process of implementing policies, what is very interesting is that even lawyers get confused with the terminologies, let alone someone who has no understanding of the law expected to read through the policies. What do you expect out of that? So it's the communication of the policies, the training. When it comes, do we really train people to understand the policies? Or we just assume that because they are academics or because they are in the academic space, they have an understanding of the policies. And in most cases, that is not the case. We also need to appreciate that with all these policies, regulations, there is what we call an unintended effect. Someone might be saying, as South Africa in higher education, we are regressing. Just recently, we had a Labor Relations Act amendment. And the amendment was actually saying, ensure that more people are employed full-time. If you reflected the statistics in South African higher education, most of the people who were working part-time were white people. So what do? Then unintendedly, when the government was hoping it was more applicable in other sectors or industry, but when you get into a higher education, that actually meant we needed to absorb white people. And I'm not saying we don't want white people. I'm just saying we need to be reflecting, how do we then transform the institution? Again, there is what we call, I think I've articulated the issue of the belly. The people within the system confine or constrain the process of having change in higher education. You can have the head, which is your senior management. In most cases, senior management is in the system for just 5 years. Those who are in the system, they have 20 years experience, 40 years experience. They have the memory of the institution. So how do we expect to drive the change? I think I'm going to stop. They say time up.
Thank you very much, Sisi. In fact, you don't notice that you are taking time, but till now we know because of the richness of what you are raising. But like Chief, you work in the space. As a result, your passion will be like that. So let me then, in thanking you, let me welcome one of our participants, Shervani. okay, as she's busy setting up the presentation, I think what I'm already picking up from, of course, everyone is picking up stuff, but I'm already picking up from the presentation is that there are varied ways that there are various ways in which policy impacts on the higher education system, on universities, and noting all the discussion that we have been having since day one, we can't say there can be a singular response to policy. And I think that's the presentation that, that's what I'm taking, not that's what your presentation was saying. That's what I'm taking from your presentation. So that's the reality. So let me then, that's fine now. Let me invite Shervani to speak to us in this discussion. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm actually from teacher education, so my perspective comes from that particular vantage point. Right. So if we're looking at our topic, which is the impact of policy, practice guidelines and other regulations for the transformation of higher education and the extent to which it regulates transformation. Firstly, there's a whole range of policies that define the transformation higher education landscape. And there are a few that I mentioned, but there are others as well, but those are the key ones. And I think very importantly, there are 5 key pillars that are articulated in the higher education policy. And the one is a single nationally coordinated system of education. Oops, I don't know if that happened. Right? The other is increased access and participation rates, increased responsiveness to societal and economic needs, program differentiation and development of niche areas, planning and coordination imperatives, but that is national and institutional plans. Okay. So those are the basic policies, and the key pillars are sort of the key principles that underpin all transformation in higher education at the moment. Right. But now if we look at transformation, what is our understanding of transformation in our context? Are you having a problem seeing? It's very small, eh? Is it okay? But okay, I'll just read it out. So firstly, there is a lack of consensus in terms of what people understand by transformation, right? It's been so many years en route, and yet there's a lack of consensus. Keat and Swartz talk about an empty dynamic, a floating signifier, an empty signifier, and I think that's very interesting that there is this lack of consensus when it comes to understanding what transformation really means. And this lack of understanding and lack of consensus occurs amongst universities and also within universities. So different people in the same university have different understandings of what transformation means. However, it is very interesting that when it comes to the calls for transformation, there is consensus. People are quite clear about what they want when it comes to what people want in terms of transformation. So these are some of them that have been identified: the Africanization of universities, decolonization, deracialization, inclusivity, and socio-political responsiveness. So I think it's very interesting that in terms of formal and institutional conceptualization and understandings, there is a lack of consensus versus action in terms of the needs of people. And there is a consensus here in terms of the needs of people. So there's this tension that exists between how we want to understand transformation and of course the call for transformation. Right. Of course, it's not really a shock that the final verdict, the main findings were that universities have not sufficiently transformed in the last 20 years. Right? Systemic and structural discrimination, as well as overt and covert racism, remains and part of the institutional culture at universities. So actually, we have not transformed. Right. Now, the question I think I begin to ask myself is this competing views of transformation the envisaged strategy? If so, how and why is it so successful? How is it linked to how we see the university and the idea of the university? And I think it's important for us to also ask, is this the strategy, and who is fundamental in promoting this particular strategy or putting forward the strategy, right? So the next question is, how is this idea of transformation linked to the idea of the university? And I would like to argue that the way we conceive of transformation of higher education in South Africa is inextricably linked to our idea of the African university. Right, so where would transformation, so if we are to ask ourselves this question, where would transformation have a better chance of emerging? An African university with a social conscience, where African values and social ontology are constitutive functions, or what we currently have, the modern Enlightenment University, which has been designed to exclude the African being in this world. Right, so going back to the theme of this discussion, and I would like to use a particular policy as a case in point. Right. Right, so before I even get to that policy, I would like to say to you that I've chosen this particular policy because it deals specifically with the curriculum, and it shapes the way curriculum is being transformed in this country. And I think if we're looking at Africanizing the university and decolonizing the university, it's important that we look at the curriculum, because the curriculum is involved with epistemology and ontology. In other words, knowing, ways of knowing and sources of knowledge. The way we construct and understand the world and our place in it. Being, which is the ontology, ways and habits of being human, of being a person. Who am I and who are you? The way we see and treat each other. So this, for me, is the fundamental part. There are many important functions of a university, but the curriculum is really, really important for these reasons. Right. So this particular policy that I'm going to look at is the revised higher education qualifications sub-framework, right? And it aims to facilitate, amongst other purposes and aims, it aims to facilitate the education of graduates will contribute to the social, cultural, and economic development of South Africa and participate successfully in the global economy and knowledge society. Now, if we look at it in terms of regulating the way we understand the higher education curriculum, and of course we have this curriculum, we don't have choices. This policy, we have to comply, right? So the focus of this policy is quality assurance, to facilitate access, and here access is more formal access than actually epistemological access. It addresses emerging skills and knowledge needs, ensures responsiveness, enhances cohesion, coherence and structure of the higher education system. It focuses on sameness and uniformity, that we all have to teach the same thing in a particular module. It focuses on compliance. It quantifies knowledge to credits and time. And in terms of epistemology, there's a strong focus on mode 1 and 2 kinds of knowledge: vocational and occupational, industrial and professional skills and competencies. Right? The knowledge base, the theory and the methodology has to relate to specific academic disciplines and fields of study. Right. So, you know, these are all some of the key concepts and some of the key driving forces within this particular policy that defines how we structure our curriculum. So, in terms of this, these are this is the focus. In terms of the policy enactment, the policy enactment, as Brightness says, the implementation is a very complex space. So in this space, so we have to take this and apply it, and in this space, this brings about many constraints because, for example, we have limited time frames. So you have a particular, I've got 2 minutes left. Okay, right. So, okay, we have limited time frames, and so people don't think too clearly about how they're going to change the curriculum or transform it fundamentally. Now, if we look at the kind of discourses that are prevalent here, we have neoliberalism, we have globalization, and we have colonialism. Right. To assess the extent to which we are regulated, we need to identify not what this policy speaks to, but what this policy is silent about. So what this policy is silent about is what people have been calling for in terms of transformation. The Africanization of the university, decolonization, deracialization, inclusivity, and socio-political responsiveness. Right. So, on the one hand, we would like to argue that we are captured as academics, we are captured by this discourse, and there's no place for us to move, that we are absolutely regulated by it. But I don't think so. I think we are regulated to a certain extent. I think policies also have spaces for us to be able to move, for us to actually be agents of change, because the same policy says, be sufficiently flexible to accommodate different types of higher education institutions and to enable institutions to pursue their own curriculum goals, creativity, and innovation. Right. So, what we have found, and we've been through this curriculum process, and we've complied with this particular policy. But unfortunately, we haven't changed anything fundamentally. Our curriculum remains largely unchanged. Right. So the question is, why have we chosen to be regulated by shallow interpretations of policies? Why have we not used the clearly articulated and very coherent responses of the fees must fall students to decolonize the curriculum? If we go to a quote by Oakeshott, he says, "The university is a conversation where quality is reflected in the voices which speak, and its value measured in the relics it leaves behind in the minds of those who participate. Yet we choose to ignore the students when they clearly give us clear indications of what is not working in the curriculum and why it's not transformed." Right, so my concluding thoughts. We choose to allow policy to regulate us because it serves our interests for our universities to remain significantly unchanged, where transformation is a non-event. Reduce the insertion of black faces in corridors, black enrollment figures, and black names in the study guides. And I say black faces in the corridors because it's symptomatic of the way we are marginalized. We cannot even hope to transform our universities unless we de-racialize our universities, people, actions, and ideas. And I think to a large extent there needs to be a bigger move to conscientize people. Because even black people, as black people ourselves, many of us reinforce the same old traditions, and I think some people just are not aware of the extent to which it is limiting. Right, we cannot allow our institutional knowledge paradigms to be defined by historical liberal ideology of disinterested knowledge, neoliberal ideology that is premised on the economic rationality that devalues our humanity. We need to redefine the idea of the university. If there's an alignment between the way we understand the university and the way we function as a university, the pot will assume a different shape. But if we allow it to be defined for us, the pot will remain intact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shervani. Let's give them another round of applause, please. I think I've exhausted my mandate. I hope that the presenters are not going to complain about my timekeeping. I was just merely interviewing for the next job that I will get, which is this one. Thank you very much. I will give over to Dina to facilitate the part around policy discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Luzuko. Quite a difficult thing to ask you to literally time keep across the generational and power divide. Okay, so colleagues, we've decided to collapse the day, as you know. And so to foreground the next workshop, we've asked those who are going to speak tomorrow to speak for a shorter period of time and to really come to the heart of the question of in what ways do we work as both scholars and practitioners to ensure that the work we do does have some impact or grapples with studying that impact. So you will notice, I'm just trying to prepare you, so while they're talking, and I'm sure you've been doing this all along, but you think about these pieces of paper on the center of the desk. What will happen after the three people who are going to speak now, when they finish, you're going to work in triads, and you're going to look at policy on the one hand and practice. Well, no, I've got two on practice, but there's one on policy and regulation and practice. The thinking of this is that if you can tease out in your triads what you feel is most of concern when it comes to policy and regulation, so that could be at an institutional level or a national level, or even bigger than that if we're considering things of international law, notions of some of the debates or the guidelines, or around academic freedom. You know, it's up to you in your discussions to identify. On the one side, what are focal points for study? And on the other side, what are focal points of informing or creating impact? In a way, we're trying to see where we can work between them. So you would be doing that in triads, teasing them out, discussing them, putting them down, and then we'll see the energy levels and where people feel. We might want to do that same sort of voting approach. One of the things that for the funders of this process that we sort of said we'd come out with is a report on those who work within this area. Where do those of us who work in this area feel is important as a pathway to impact, so that is not predefined. So it's quite important that we have this discussion and that we come up with some solutions if not. Should I just read quickly? I don't know if everybody has read what the brief sort of is for this around pathways of impact. Could I read it quickly? Has everybody read it? No, I read it. Okay. Pathways to impact is a phrase prevalent in the UK funding landscape, but I think it's wider. It's around development studies, really. Used to describe strategies for the translation of research findings to those who can make a difference or affect change. It encompasses academic, economic, and societal research. Pathways to impact may include, for instance, informing policy, capacity building, practitioner involvement, including student voices, unions, transformation, diversity officers, community engagement, feeding into curricula and education across the life course, and working in partnership with the media, or press, the arts, NGOs, and governmental organizations. So it's quite large. The problematics of achieving pathways to impact for those in critical university studies, some of them have been very much discussed by the previous scholars, but they may also include institutional or professional risk. I think many of us feel that. Researcher precarity, and funding mechanisms which do not support or reward this area of academic activity. So now I'd like to ask Viv, Winnie, and Michael to touch on aspects of pathways, the possibilities and problematics of pathways to impact. But also, yeah, that's great, if you can. Are you all right to start? Thank you. Yeah, this is difficult.
Yeah, it is a bit difficult. Can I put it here? Okay. All right. I haven't really had a great deal of time to prepare this because Dina came to me about 10 or 20 minutes ago. I was going to sit tonight really and do this.
Don't blame it on me. Everyone voted it in, eh?
Okay, well then you'll just have to live with it. But I thought I'd pick up on some random things related to practice rather than policy in the last couple of days that we've heard about. I'm going to focus on what was said and also some of the things that I think may have been left out. I think we spoke a little bit about interdisciplinarity, which is really bringing together things like, for example, the economic and the political. But I would say that, and to have a fuller understanding of both of those or more, but I think that we need to move beyond that to what Menon talks about as indisciplinarity, which is really looking at the interstices of settled disciplines and about their consequent dismantling and bringing into view new objects of knowledge, maybe even the CUS that we're talking about. I really like this book by La Papason, and I think Michelinos referred to this book, and I sort of think that it might be very useful for this project. He talks about they talk about the practical work of decolonization to help assess the academic industrial complex. And he says that they say that the decolonial is always already amid the colonial, which is also what Tiongo was claiming. Another thing that they bring into perspective is how land is important for the modern university, and that is something that I don't think that we've really spoken about. If we look at South Africa and see which universities own which land, it's already telling a huge story, and the capital that they gain from that land. So I think that is something that we haven't spoken about. I also really like the work of Stefano Hani and Fred Moten. They've written a book called The Undercommons, where they talk about the university. And Andre, you spoke a lot about the concept of critical, and of course it's in the title. They have a problem with the notion of criticality and see it as coming from professionals inside the university who are needing to justify the work that they're doing through critique, but they never sort of really are changing what's going on there. You know, it's just a practice that perpetuates itself. But I liked what you said about critique is imagining the new work of love and justice. I think that's a really nice way of framing it. And you also said the critical shouldn't become its own dogma. It must remain critical of itself. And it's incomplete, trying to catch up with the moment of where the university is. I think that we can look at different ways of doing administration, teaching, and scholarship. For example, you know, why are we spending so much time sitting in committees in university? What are we actually achieving in those committees? Is it just a sort of a place where people can go and sort of chat endlessly for hours? And also the style of management. I think we heard last week how people were forced into forms of mentorship that they found unacceptable. So we need to find other ways of relating to colleagues and to students. And there was mention of a reading group, doing reading groups differently. I know that it's made a lot of difference in my work with across institutions and with PhD students, where you all are sitting there with a genuine curiosity. And you know, there's a free atmosphere where people can ask any questions. We're reading text aloud. So these are sort of practices which become more egalitarian, I think. Another thing we didn't really talk about was neurotypicality, which I think is very important in the university. We can't assume that everyone learns in similar ways and has access to similar ways of interacting with the world. So how can people who are considered atypical, neurotypical, contribute to curricula, to pedagogy, and to building alternative knowledges, rather than just being accommodated? How do we also teach to accommodate difference and to bring in different expressions of knowledges and being? So, you know, the notion of heterogeneous worldings coming together for a political ecology of practices and really negotiating difference with each other. Erin Manning also talks about research creation and experimentation and delighting in the as yet unthought. So I'm still trying to understand myself what critical university studies is, even though I was sent the PowerPoint. And I think that it would be good to sort of map out, as I was talking to Andre at lunchtime, you know, how we see that and how we can build on that. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I think there are many of us feeling this is an amorphous beast, and somehow we're going to have to, probably one of the first steps would be to try to work around that. Winnie?
I can go here? Okay, thank you very much. I like the title of the sub-theme on the session because it says possibilities are problematics of pathways. And really that is the tension that is embedded in usually when you want to, on impact. Because sometimes you think you have very good research output or knowledge, but that knowledge is a problem to the other, wherever you are taking it. So there is always that running tension. And for that matter, usually what I see as very critical is agenda setting. When you are setting the research agenda, how do you set that research agenda? If it's an inwardly set agenda, definitely you are bound to have more problems in taking it wherever you want to take it. But if you set it in a collaborative manner, then it's likely to sell before even you finish your critical studies. So I think those parameters are the tensions that exist in this kind of work that one has to quite bear in mind. So the setting of the agenda is very critical in terms of research, which you can call research and collaboration. When you want to undertake that focus or changing knowledge or analysis, whatever position you want to take, how do you do it in such a way that it will, at the end of the day, be useful elsewhere, not only to you? But again, I think the other dimension is that, I don't know whether I call it knowledge for prosperity. You know, the kind of knowledge, everybody wants you to do knowledge now for SDGs. But there is also some knowledge that is not just for SDGs. It's not just for Agenda 2063. Probably as a scholar, you have far insights into even seeing further than Agenda 2063 and SDGs. So that's another pool of knowledge that universities are entitled to also pursue, that they must pursue. So we should not just restrict ourselves to the kind of agenda that is going to sell to any other person who wants to get knowledge, new knowledge. We will be having some knowledge that is not acceptable. And I think that's really where the tension begins, like when we talk about coloniality and all this. The hegemony is very deep down there, so when we have the SDGs, they're embedded in that. Probably Agenda 2063 is not. But if you look at Agenda 2063 closely, it's also not very different from SDGs. For those of you who have looked at it, it's not radical as such. It's quite into the normal framework that even if you think you want to pick Agenda 2063, which you might assume is then very much African, it picks a lot of those others as well, if you criticize it to the letter. So I think another area is partnership and agency. If you want to really get impact, you have to nurture partnerships. And maybe we could call them strategic partnerships that one has to nurture. And these partnerships, I know the tension is between whether you have very localized ones, whether you have the regional ones, whether you have the global ones. But the world is telling us that now everybody's going global. So you just can't look inward. So I guess when you go global, then you have to be very strategic in the kind of partnerships that you nurture to work with. Whether it's in terms of getting money, because even just networks, even just dissemination, even just that policy brief you want to do so that you can have an impact cost money. So somebody has to fund it. So who is going to fund it? So the element of funding is another, partnership that you must always work with, right from conceptualizing, setting your agenda, to doing your research, to coming out with a noble idea. You have to work with funding, and where is this funding going to come from? And then the agencies that can help you get this message out is another element, because there is a limit to how much academicians can do in terms of impact. You can't be the one doing the hard thinking, you are the one doing the research, you are the one writing, you are the one going out there to be the activist. So you might pick an activist, an entity, or an NGO, or another intermediary, let's call it an intermediary, that then becomes the agency. But then the other issue comes, have you written in a language that these people can even consume and sell? So again, the second level comes of how do we make our outputs understandable to the ordinary person out there so that they can consume and use it. And that's why a lot of people use the policy brief way. That's also even, it has its own problems. But how do we synthesize output such that it can have impact? Because even if you go to bureaucrats who needs to use our knowledge, because that's where development lies, the bureaucrat is not going to read that 300 pages output that you have produced. They probably just need a pager. Now they are doing infographics, just basic infographics, which they can watch in 5 minutes, and they are good to go. So like this critical university studies, if we were to penetrate higher education, I think in the morning, I didn't quite agree with the position of separating higher education from critical university studies. To me, it's like it's the overarching of higher education. Critical university studies could be the overarching of higher education, because unless higher education brings in critical university studies, then there would be very little change going forward in terms of how you move forward. But just as I conclude, if you look at African universities at the beginning of, during independence, a lot of them were set very close to what Satish was saying. They were set with particular purpose. Like Senegal was really for intellectual recovery and generation of knowledge and counter-colonialism. So it would be very good today to check what is Senegal producing? How is their education different from another university, for example, Eduardo Mondlane, which was set for producing civil servants, human resource. It was set to produce human resource. So you cannot go and critique it and say it's not taking the right path of critical, because that's not its mandate. It's meant to produce human resource. Some, like Brazzaville, were expected to produce executives. Ghana was promoting African unity. So you want to check, that was its mandate. It could have added others, but it was basically set to do the African unity. And I think even Dar es Salaam was quite in line with that. So I think those overarching then also help us to see that when now we are bringing in the element of critical university education, how do we take it out there? Because it's not quite, critical university studies is not quite deep in Africa, if I was to generalize. Not many people understand what it's talking about, and its lenses and language. And yet, if you listen to it, if you know what it is, then you know the closest which it comes to is pedagogy, those who are into pedagogy and philosophy. But it's still having more than that. So I think I want to stop there, but there are many pathways. There are about 3 pathways to impact, which are not straightforward, depending on what you have. But the overall for me is really setting the agenda. If you are setting agenda in isolation, chances of impact are very minimal.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Thank you so much. So I see a lot of synergy in what we've been doing here, what we did in the past week, and the workshops of today, talking about pathways for advancing critical university studies. So we've recognized that the context in which African universities are operating is that of a post-colonial heritage landscape, which is very much crippled by the global knowledge economy. And within that, the roots of the university on this continent has been recognized also as having some ancient roots, but also very much influenced by the 19th century project, which is what we are practicing today. So we need to take to be cognizant of that fact, to take cognizance of that fact, while looking at how this kind of university will be in conversation with other parts of the world. Having said that as a kind of introduction, I see the pathways that could be open to us in terms of epistemological, and I like Shervani's introduction of the ontology also into this, and also institutional, so epistemological, institutional, breaking boundaries, and also and creating critical partners. So those are four kind of pathways that I see. And so the first one would be the need to strengthen disciplines by drawing on the socio-cultural context within which African universities operate. So the African epistemological systems within that which we operate will be important in strengthening critical university studies here, so that the foundation discipline of critical thinking, philosophy, being at the foundation of all the disciplines that to which we bring our students, should be taken seriously. That's something we can develop as others are doing. And secondly, critical university studies on the continent should aim at advancing what I said, was it in the morning, from STEM to STEAM. So we know that many of our universities get a lot more funding for science, technology, education, engineering and mathematics. But our whole lives, our life stories are told by the arts, the humanities, which are very critical in creating thinkers, which is what Africa needs. And I'm going to end with that. So STEAM should be what we should be aiming at in sort of a critical university, the kind of critical university studies we are aiming at on this continent. Collaboration and partnerships on the continent, which should involve both academics and students, because we know too little about ourselves. We have to begin to develop pathways of collaborating. So student exchange programs, which I'm constantly critiquing my university about, they are from the south to the north. We should begin to look elsewhere, academics and students moving across the continent. That's something we can drive, and we can drive that also in discussion with the African Universities Association, which is a very important body on this continent. It's not yet as developed as we would want to see it. And get regional and continental bodies involved in or interested in this drive. Talking about ECOWAS, the last time I saw ECOWAS has now put together a call for papers for some project. I was very impressed about that. ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, the African Union, getting this to help drive critical universities on this continent. So this is a work which, there's a lot of work to be done, but I would like to say that we've begun. Those of us here, they've even gotten me interested in work in this area. So we have started. It's a work of transformation that we can commit to drive. And the end result, if well driven, would be to produce thinkers, which our continent needs. Our continent needs thinkers to drive change, to drive development. And that can only result from the kind of project we are setting up for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm sure as you were listening, there was parts that were striking a chord, and there were parts where people were already disagreeing, right? So now if we can shift to workshop mode, you will see in front of you, there are these two pieces of paper with policy and regulation on one hand and practice. So there are many of us who are very, very critical of policy and notions of being regulated by it. And of course, that should be brought to bear to this. But there are those of us sitting in positions at the moment where we are supposedly informing policy. And so having a good idea of which areas of that of policy should be studied to consider their effects, or how our thematics can feed into a study of policy, a particular lens. And then also on the other side of that, in what ways can we shape or change policy or regulation? So, for instance, I'm part of a group that looks at UK funding from the perspective of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And before we even began, we commissioned a whole sort of review to look at the perverse incentives created by equality, diversity, and inclusion policy. That was, it's an incredibly powerful way to start. So you remove all of that nonsense of benevolence and inevitability of where it will lead before you even start. So, so the first one is around policy and regulation, if you can discuss those in groups and jot down focal points. There's a line between, because there may be connections between, but chances are there probably are also areas where there won't be. So you can draw, annotate, make it your own, right? And then the other idea is practice. So the joys of these past few days have been that we haven't just gathered as academics. So I guess I'm speaking first to the academics. So practice here, of course, is understood in various ways of academic practice, whether that be one's research, one's teaching, one's community engagement, one's intellectual academic voice, one's academic citizenry within your university, but it extends beyond that. In what way can we look at aspects of committee practice, funding practice, all sorts of aspects. So if you can tease those out and think of in what ways should we be studying aspects of the ways in which institutions, or larger than that, universities, work within spaces, and in what ways should we be informing that practice. Considering that we are at the moment in a very unique space where for the first time there is this idea of funding pathways to impact of higher education studies. Okay, so I can see the energy levels are really low. So if you can try to activate yourself, I don't know if you need to move. Can I ask for people that are too similar or in too much of a similar context to separate, people who know each other too well to separate, and to work in groups of 3, okay, to tease this out. Okay, and we'll have about 20 minutes for you to write on these documents.
Any big ideas?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we need microphones there.
Yeah.
Here's one.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so this plan. Going around the tables, it seemed like there was quite a lot of synergy in terms of the ideas that everyone had articulated and used. And so, particularly in terms of policy and ideas around policy, a lot of the thoughts that we had within our group were around developing or engaging with think tanks. And I guess enlisting them as co-producers in policy and working with them through varying interventions. Thinking about scale, impact and influence. So what's the reach of CUS? What are we looking to do? How might we align across the continent and engaging with European partners that have a desire to want to do this work from an organic place? How can we work alongside them as partners? Then thinking about academic alignment. So working with, again, working with academics that have an interest in the area and can bridge the gap between, can bridge that praxis gap basically, so can align theory and practice and put those two together. Working with various stakeholders, such as parliamentarians in any geopolitical context, or members of particular political administrations. Funding agencies. I think a big question for us was where ethically there has to be some sort of ethical cognizance in terms of where the money is coming from. So is it at the expense of a particular group of people, and making sure that when we do retrieve funds or gain funding for these types of endeavours, that they are ethically sourced, basically. And yeah, that was it. And then in terms of informing, it was just things around transparency, Freedom of Information Act, what's it? RTI. Right, Information Act, yeah. What else was there? Yep. Then there was the idea that, which has kind of been espoused a lot in the last couple of days, that the university has to be more closely aligned to what's happening in the community. So a university is a microcosm of society, and therefore it needs to serve that society, particularly as people, more often than not, whether they went to university or not, will pay into that system through tax. And then ideas around media dissemination, so the various media platforms that are now used to disseminate particular types of knowledge, and create kind of critical masses and critical clusters, and most importantly, lobbying.
Are you happy? Absolutely. Okay. Tony's group.
Okay. Gosh. For policy, are we doing policy first? Is that the idea, or are we doing both together? Okay. So for study, it was emphasizing the mapping of different policies in different contexts, and the emphasis of that mapping will maybe depend on what our interests are.
Andre? Hello. Sorry, do you want Sharon to read from her group's thing, or just to talk about what emerged? Because everyone's read it. Yeah. And,
okay.
And it's on the piece of paper.
Yeah, what emerged? Like the main idea, I said, I asked what are the big ideas? Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Jason had an entire table full of big ideas.
After having negotiated the space, yeah. I mean, I just think so you can
Yeah.
speak in terms of having read the space.
I suppose we talked about mapping, critiquing, and trying to develop new ways of thinking about policy and flipping that over into how we would then start to engage with the policy process. There's lots of detail, and we're talking about dissemination and consultation and all the rest of it. I suppose one of the ideas that came out of this the conversation was ways of trying to identify the values that underpin the way we thought things ought to be and start to enact that in our own approaches. Maybe that's morphing over to the practice, but so it's about trying to identify what's there and what's wrong with it and how it can be changed at a policy level, which is almost like at a system level, and then at a level of practice in how we do things ourselves, trying to find ways of making that happen as a model for how things might be. One of the things that came up, which was how we got rid of things that we were doing because we were part of a system and we wanted to get rid of. And we eventually developed the concept of intellectual exorcism. How could we have a model for intellectual exorcism for identifying what we wanted to stop and stop doing it? Intellectual exorcism. What else was there? Yeah, another example was about, in terms of different sorts of practice, was part of the whole value of the Pathways to Impact approach is about co-creation. And so developing models where we give our students the opportunity to co-create in very concrete ways, such as engaging with local communities, letting the communities identify topics for research and getting students to do those projects as part of their own dissertations or whatever, so that the students get an opportunity to do a project in a real life situation and the community gets an opportunity to get some evidence that they can use in their own lobbying. But the point is just trying to demonstrate ways in which knowledge can be created in collaboration with other groups and outside the boundaries of the academy. In terms of, sorry, going back and forth a little bit here, in terms of policy, one of the things that we wondered is there's a lot of international or transnational organizations. Is it possible, sometimes if you can make changes in terms of sort of policy frameworks or aspirational frameworks within those transnational organizations, the effort involved in doing that will pay off in greater terms in regard to legitimizing different ways of doing things. I know this from my own work with the Council of Europe, but there may be transnational organizations that we can use in other contexts to do the same thing. I think Michael in the previous session talked about the African Association of Universities as an example. Yeah, so there's a variety of those sometimes a bit of effort focused on them and getting them to change some of their frameworks could actually be beneficial at providing legitimacy at a local level to start moving things in different directions as a possibility. Is there anything else?
So this is sort of from our discussions and looking around as well. Two thoughts. One is I think these are both practice issues, although they might not appear as such in obvious ways. One is, Viv mentioned this idea of, I don't know exactly how you said it, but something of like things that we can't imagine yet. And I think at the same time as we do these very practical efforts to advocate for more inclusion and for more representation and everything else, how do we also create spaces in which it is possible for things that are not yet imaginable to emerge? And I think pedagogy is one place that is possible, and sharing ideas of how we might create those kinds of practices of learning and unlearning, and share that with each other. And then I think the other dimension, and it's sort of taken from this other table, but something I've been thinking a lot about as well, is this idea of learning from failure. And I'm wondering if, not necessarily as something that we share outwardly with everyone as this network, but something that we do internally is discuss our failures and our mistakes and other things that we thought were going to work but didn't, and our own kind of limit points, so that we have a place to debrief that as we continue to do that difficult work of like the outward face to keep pushing. But there's also a place that we need for debriefing that I would very happily help to host, I guess.
Maybe we need a debriefing post-mortem working group. A group that keeps questioning. Is it really working in the way that we want it to work? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Is that what you have in mind, Shervani?
I mean, that's the role I usually play in the groups that I'm a part of, but I don't know if, you know, that people want that or are ready for it yet, or like.
Or do you think the entire group wants to do that? Or do you think that there's a particular working group?
I don't know. I think it's more like if that's something that is of interest, because I think in our kind of siloed institutional spaces where we are really concerned with like standing the ground and creating a space for things to be possible, and therefore we don't have that space to question ourselves and what we're doing because we are so busy defending. So people might be looking for spaces where they can say, actually, I don't know if what I'm doing is right, but I have to say to the institution that it is, or else I'll lose the very limited space that I already have. So if there are people interested in doing that, then yeah, it doesn't have to be formal or anything, but.
No, we can have a group for that. Okay. No, I think it's because it's also part of the idea that people working in the social justice field from critical paradigms sometimes gets very caught up within their own forms of thinking in any case. And so, and that's the new dogmas that sometimes arise out of that same groups. So having a particular kind of reflexive exercise where one can think, you know, whether you are not actually mimicking the thing that you are fighting against is a very good thing to do.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember there was a question that was raised about Rhodesia, why it was initiated where it is now and how it has changed. Precisely because some of the dealings and ongoing of Rhodesia have led to the change of what the organization is now, and it's no longer representative of that which had initiated it.
Yeah. And I think, for instance, the limits that we place on how other people struggle to imagine differently is also the limits that we have ourselves in various different kinds of ways. So those kind, I really think, you know, that this is a crucial idea around emancipation. And that is for the self, it's a very, very difficult to achieve in any case, because those horizons are so framed in ways that it steers your thinking, you know? Even in the way in which we engage with policy, you know? The terms and the frames for engaging with policy is more or less set, whether you have critical or reformist or whatever kind of slant that you have, you know? So, yeah. So I think this idea, yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Chief? Brightness? Luzuko was very active in that group, so maybe I should ask him too. Okay, anybody here?
I can go because I was the scribe, just only because I can read my handwriting. The main emphasis was on issues of social justice how research can be oriented in such a way that it addresses issues of social justice and policies that are put in place. I think Jason also alluded to the issue of ethics, in research, but for us it's more about issues of social justice, diversity practices, and issues of equity. So there were two positions. One, that you have institutions who have policies that are not necessarily addressing these issues. Some are just rhetoric, really, and others are actually reinforcing these polarities and injustices. And the other was coming together, putting together mechanisms in place that would ensure a more consultative process to policy making, so that there's space for a wider stakeholder to be involved in policy formulation for purposes of either shaping the policy, the direction of the policy, or even challenging and critiquing the policies that are being proposed. There was the concern of the income disparities between senior management, or rather I should say policies that promote income disparities between senior management and academics, so that the interest of where the university or the institutions is going gets disjointed in a way. And then colleagues will obviously come in if I'm misrepresenting them. Policies that should ensure that there is a concrete and real sharing of resources, like journals, like labs, aided libraries. I know the Eastern Cape is a very nice program where 3 institutions are sharing a library. And policies that would ensure that the issue of research institutes that keep being rewarded, the research institutes that reward researchers from the global north more than the global south, so that policies enacted should be able to look into that aspect directly, and not only utilize researchers from the global north, and start to integrate emerging researchers that may not necessarily have achieved an academic status of a particular nature, but that not as independent, but can participate and benefit from some of the research groupings. Yeah. I think, have I left anything? Oh, the nature of certain policies, like for example, in the case of South Africa, the funding policy, which actually work to stifle transformation and expand inequalities between institutions. Some of these policies are actually enacted and work to reinforce the persistent legacy of institutional cultures that are not responsive to transformation. In other words, you might have progressive policies in place, but these policies are unable to penetrate some of the entrenched institutional cultures that actually work against the transformation the very same policies are trying to address. I don't know if some of my colleagues want to add.
I think that just the whole notion of casualization of staff and how certain people are advantaged and others are disadvantaged, and the way universities are cutting costs actually by relying on casualized staff who are exploited. So. Yeah, precarity. Yeah.
But the assumption here would be that policies actually have a progressive intent, which is probably one has to question that particular assumption.
Yes, please. I just want to say that our subgroup,
You had a small subgroup in this?
Yeah, we had
Very creative.
Our subgroup approached the task in a very different way, so I just thought I'd share that. Yeah, sure. And we instead of approaching it from the idea generation, like we're just going to write down all the ideas, we kind of did a kind of conceptual or an analytical approach to it. So it's a bit different, maybe, from what everybody else has done. So we kind of thought about, what are we thinking about, first of all? So we thought about it metacognitively and separated out all the thinking into the three main domains. So that whatever it is that we're doing, it concerns these three domains, which are the domain of research, the domain of teaching and learning, and the domain of responsiveness to societal needs and imperatives. Then we thought about both the policy and the practice through the lens of these three domains, because whatever idea you're generating is going to relate slightly differently depending which domain you're talking about. Then in approaching all three, we kind of identified three main aspects of policy and context that we wanted to address, which were funding mechanisms and problems, technology, and ethics and norms. So they were kind of three there's ethics and norms. 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 Not roads. Only the National Road Authority would think that roads are norms, right? Yeah, and so then when we norms as in normative, normality. And then we thought of how we would, so that was kind of what we had to study. We had to study the funding mechanisms and problems, we had to study what's happening with technology, we have to study what's happening with ethics and norms, and then what is that to inform? That's to inform how we think about funding models, how we think about transparency, how we think about justice and social change, how we think about values-based education, how we think about normative transformation. So we kind of mapped it.
As was because of the data on this thing, I can't have a favorite presentation, but I really like this one.
You may continue favoritizing us, right? Then when we thought more fine-grained about practice, again the three domains of research, teaching and learning, responsiveness to societal imperatives and needs, we looked at all of this like through an overarching question about epistemologies and the need to pluralize epistemologies. So, and there were three domains of these, yes, that we needed to study. So what we need to study is we need to study collaboration models, we need to study curriculum innovations, and we need to study development paradigms and development goals. And we want to study these to inform collaboration improvements, to inform curriculum learning and change, and to inform professional practices and policy change. So that's how we thought.
We should develop this.
Can I suggest that we have a working group? I know this is going to kill everyone. No. Because the one thing about a lot of the funding now is that there is funding to have impact. And I know a lot of us who have worked in higher education studies, critical education studies, have gotten to the point of saying, oh, we want to either leave this field because all we do is publish on it and don't do justice to those who we're trying to change it for, or there must be an impact. So I really think having the subject of this impossibility of pathways to impact and trying to have a working group that looks at what works and researching what works, debating what works, collating information about what works, suggesting what works, is actually a real contribution. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there a nice acronym for that? Right? Can you take us Oh, the other one, of course, that I was thinking about is that the conversation with policy can be a very, very painful exercise, right? Because the subjects captured in that policy doesn't correlate with the social justice project from the beginning. But out of the threes from suicide, what we may have is actually a kind of a policy framework for what a critical university study, what a critical university that is engaged would look like. That kind of broad parameters. So instead of working against something that is in the space, try and imagine, of course, how would things like this look like, if we had our say, if we create a new university that is locally engaged, that has a global awareness, and so on and so on. How would that particular kind of university look like? Eh? Because in most instances, we have been steered by UN prototype legislations in any case that have come down to other spaces. I'm talking about from a critical point of view. What would be the options of those kinds of prototypes look like? And then put that into the field as well, because then that becomes a conversational policy. Because to retrospectively think that a policy regime that is so rooted in different sets of paradigms would respond to social justice imperatives in ways that we think it may, we will have small wins, and that's also important. But we can have bigger ideas to think about. Right?
We have an input. But I'm thinking of what you said, just said now, and part of my presentation, some of the part that I did not cover. A part of me have this sense that policies remain at senior management. They don't actually cascade down to the people that they are supposed to.
Sometimes those cases cascade down.
Sometimes let's stick to it, doesn't.
Yeah.
But again, I think a part of me, a sense that I was having, how do we begin to give back the power to the people? Which, for me, it was how do we now invest the pyramid, which the majority of the people are at the bottom. Can we invest and give the power to the people by educating them about the policies, training, communication? Because for me, at this particular point, we cannot achieve what we want to achieve if people do not take ownership of the policies. The reason why some of the things happen in the institution is that people don't even know their rights. If you do know your rights, you are able to argue your case based on the rights.
Thank you so much. That group finally came along.
Oh.
You have rescued them right now. They are just, thank you. All right.
And then
this is the working group now. Nominations. Oh.
I think Chief said here, the issue of the unintended effects of policy is not coming out only in what has already been articulated there. I mean, the issue of ranking, the issue of publishing, the issue of PhDs, by virtue of now that we want to have more PhD students or people graduating, there are also unintended effects. I mean, there was a case, I think it was in University of KwaZulu-Natal, where one of the colleagues was killed because he wanted to reveal that there were selling qualifications in that university. So there are so many issues, publish or perish. But it's a case of, can we now look at the quality instead of the quantity? But the question, how do we do that? Because now it's a question, I have 4 articles, I have 6 articles, but are they making a meaningful impact to drive social justice in South Africa? At this particular point, I'm not sure if they do that.
For sure. Right, is this, sorry, go back to the working group now? Yeah. Okay. It is parents, teachers, mobilization.
Yeah, I was like, please turn on, but actually, oh, it's wrong, it's I. So never mind.
Oh, yes, so.
Operational impact.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Who wants to be members of party? Okay. Right? This group that was so powerful here now.
Yeah, okay, we're going to do a briefing now.
Give me the names of that group 5.
Sue, Winnie, Charles,
Amos,
Amos, Michael. No. This is not right.
Yeah.
This kind of exclusivity that you want to have over this group must be dismantled. Right?
I mean, I would like to be in it as well.
Are you guys happy to have Dina in this group?
Sorry,
I'm just checking.
whether we like it or not, she's in it.
Let's work on the group.
The 5 members here, are you happy to have Dina as part of the group?
Yes.
I'm just checking.
Chief, it would be very nice, even if you were like a, what do you call it, like to be within there, maybe not like in an unofficial capacity. You know what I mean?
Chief is also responsible for distributing the research subsidy funding.
I really think so. And I know we're tired, but I just want to say.
It's fine. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the things that the Critical University Studies group in the UK was have a session with a person who does the policy briefing, and literally sit with a whole bunch of early career researchers and say, you want you to have an impact on policy. This is how it looks. This is why it looks this way. This is who you need to speak to. This is how you need to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you don't know that unless there's somebody from the inside of government or inside translating in a very practical way.
Okay, what do I have to do now, Dina? What do we have to do now?
Okay, so the only other thing is, I guess, to give people time instead of us asking. There were 2. So there's, these sorts of areas. I think maybe people will and put their names after we've sort of done thanks and stuff on that.
I'm going to go with Sharon on that one.
Okay, so. And then also we had a lot of discussions with people who were like, you should read this book, or this is really amazing, or.
Yeah, that's true.
So.
Work on the black on the red.
I mean, there's amazing stuff, but if we're trying to talk about also not having a reading group that is dominated by others, then.
Because that will be probably part of the online design as well. And we need this because there's so many things that I picked up that I need to get from people,
Yeah. So of course we'd all contribute. Maybe people who really feel, I know there's a few things I don't want on that list, might also be people who want to put their names there. Do you know what I mean? If you think of how we can shape this. Yeah?
No, this is not it.
So is there anybody who would really like to take the role of coordinating that list?
This list?
The reading list. So Sharon's there as coordinator.
Because Eros is there with the online.
Jason? You have just been, this is the thing, Andrew, the bad student. You have just been nominated to be the coordinator of the Critical University Studies Reading Group. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah, it's totally fair, yeah. There's only 3 of us in it. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay.
I still think it's such a should go because you can.
Yeah, put something on that, please.
Are you?
Yeah. Who's the coordinator? Who's the coordinator of party? Sue. Thank you so much, Sue.
I'm very coordinating more than one thing. Let me just check. I'm not coordinating more than one thing. Okay, party is fine.
Not even appearing anywhere else.
Okay.
Okay, that then concludes session 5 then as well.
Yes, so once we finish, people can just add their names if they'd like to, right?
Okay. Is there anybody else? We're going to go for closure now. Can you just check we can go. Why? Right. Okay, so we can close. Anybody who would like to make a closing comment or something like that? Because we're going to say goodbye to each other now. Sorted. Oh, the working groups, you will have to write into the bigger group, on the progress and reports,
Yeah, so we already got the title of that already.
And we're gonna get there to ask. We have somebody who will remind you to write into that space, No more questions. Any concluding remarks? Okay, right. So shall I then just finish it off? Okay, right. Lovely. Let me say thank you to all of you. This has been fantastic having you around for the past 4 or 5 days. Fascinating to have old friends, new comrades, old comrades coming together in this space. Now, Dina and I would not have imagined a few months back when we started writing this thing together, that it will turn out to be such a lovely space. And apart from all the complexities and the challenges, one feel a sense of achievement, at this very moment for the kinds of things that came through here. I'm not going to have to, so thanks to all of you and have a safe journey back. So give yourselves a nice hand, man. So great stuff. Then to my collaborator, Dina, a nice hand to her, please, man. Thank you so much. And then the videographers, the caterers, the people who gave us wine, food. Annie, can you please stand? Then, of course, Annie, Jesse, Chisma, come. Are you guys representing the group now? Okay. So Jenny sends all her love. She fell ill this morning. She had to go back to bed, and I said to her that we will be closing down if she wants to come and greet. Can't get out of bed, so she sends all her love and greetings, and safe travels to all of you. So thanks to Jenny, who's been, and Deronik, who's been holding the thing together. Okay? Yeah.
Yes, thank you to everyone who's been part of organizing this. And I think it's been really amazing to bring all of you here and really to have this opportunity. I'm part of a newer, a younger generation, even though I've aged and I'm not so young, who are struggling with the place in the hierarchy of studying these things. And so it's really nice to have this time, an honor to learn from you all. And lekker, Andre. It's been very, very nice. But please, this cannot end here. Really. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and let's continue. Thank you, Andre.
So the arrangements for your shuttles will now be from the hotel. You will link up with Derek whilst we gather in the building next door, and we just confirm those. Okay?
Sorry, and then Brightness has very cleverly suggested, should we have a group shot? We should have done it the other day, but should we do that? All right. I don't know if we should cluster on the top there. All right.